Hey y'all, Coach in the Fight here, showing you why I believe the scripture is telling us that the third temple will be constructed in the fall of 2020. Now, you can check our channel for several videos we've done in the recent past on the third temple, its construction, what it will be like, where it will be, how it will be built, who will be the priests, and other subjects related to the third temple. We've done several classes on the third temple, and subscribe to our channel for future classes that we will put out on the third temple as we continue to get revelations related to its timing, its construction, and any and everything else that the Father chooses to reveal to us. Now, understand that this is information that has been revealed to me, not anything that I've heard from any place else except the Holy Spirit that dwells in me and which has been my teacher for the past 27 years. So if you have any questions about what I'm telling you, please use the comment button below. I do try to answer all comments on our channel. Now, to begin with, I want to go over to Revelation chapter 15 and show you how the temple is to be constructed before the vials are opened. You look here in verse 5, he says, "And I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And the seven angels came out of the temple, having the seven plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles." And we see down in verse 7 that these seven angels which had these seven plagues is talking about the seven vials of Revelations. So from what we can understand here is that before we ever get to the seven vials, the third temple will be opened, called the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven. Now let me show you another place that confirms this. Now, jumping over here in chapter 8 and verse 1, John is telling us about the seventh seal and what occurs when the seventh seal is opened. Now, we've done classes on our channel on the seals and what they are, coming from the scripture. So please check those classes to get an understanding of the seals and how they were opened throughout history. I do not want to redo those lessons here, but what I do want to show you is how the temple is once again being opened before the trumpets blow. You see right there in verse 1, the seventh seal is opened, but in verse 2, you see that the angels which stood before God were given seven trumpets. But look down here at verse 3 and 4, it says, "And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of the saints upon the golden altar which is before the throne." Verse 4 says, "And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand." Now this reminds me of the responsibilities of Aaron in the temple. That time when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies to get atonement for all of Israel. But if you look right here in verse 5, he says, "And the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And there was voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake." Now notice how it talks about voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. You can use the word voices as it is mentioned in Revelations and in other books like Matthew to understand the timing of the temple and when it will be constructed. These voices will be one of the things that we will notice when the third temple is opened. Many people will start to hear these voices from within. So what's being talked about here is actions that will take place in the temple. But notice down here in verse 6 how it is after those events take place that the seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Again, what we're understanding is that the temple is opened before the 7 trumpets ever blow. Now, this is confirmed again over in chapter 14. Verse 14 says, "And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle." But when you go on down below, it's talking about angels coming out of the temple. And we see over there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the verse that a lot of people will refer to as the rapture, the word cloud being used over there. And here we see a relationship between the cloud and the temple. But what I wanted to show you here is how these cloud and these temple events take place before the last plagues. You see over there in verse 1 of chapter 15, it says, "And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God." Now, we understand Revelations to be several parallel narratives, meaning the same story told over and over from different perspectives. So in these parallel narratives is telling us over and over that the temple, the 3rd temple, will be constructed before the trumpets and before the vials and after the 6th seal is opened. And again, check that video that we did on the seals so that you would know that we are in the 6th seal. But now I want to jump over here to verse 11 to make a connection between the temple and what we read over there in the book of Daniel. Looking at verse 18 of chapter 11, it says, "And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth." Now, jumping over here to the book of Daniel right quick, in chapter 12 verse 1, he says, "And at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book." Now notice verse 2. He says, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Now this is paralleling what we see over in the book of Revelations. But notice in verse 19, he goes on to talk about the temple. He says, "And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings, and voices, and thunderings, and an earthquake, and great hail." Again, we see these voices, and we have this earthquake, and we have great hail. But now, looking at that part where it talks about the great hail, if you look back over in Revelation chapter 8 and verse 7, he says, "And the first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood." Again, letting us know that the temple is opened before the sounding of the trumpets, because the first sounding of the trumpets is when we get that hail and fire mingled with blood. So the chronology of all of this is important. So let's continue to make this connection between what we're seeing in Revelation chapter 11 and what we see over in the book of Daniel chapter 12. Again, notice in verse 18 how it says, "And the time of the dead, that they should be judged," occurs simultaneously with the opening of the temple of God. And then notice down it says, "And that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name." Look over in Daniel, it's in verse 3 of chapter 12, it says, "And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever." This is the same thing that it's talking about here. These are the same events that's being talked about. So now let's drop down further in chapter 12 so we can see when these events are supposed to take place. Because Daniel is telling us when the third temple is supposed to be constructed. Let me show you how. When you look at verse 11, it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days." Now, to understand what he's talking about when he says that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, you have to jump over to 2 Kings and chapter 25. So you're looking in verse 8, during the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, one of his servants came to Jerusalem in the 5th month and the 7th day of the month. When you look down there in verse 9, it says, "And he burnt the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house burnt he with fire." Now, you go on down in the 25th chapter of the book of 2 Kings, and you see all that they did to the temple. Not only did they burn it down, but you see down in verse 13 and 14, they took away the daily sacrifice. They took away the pots, the shovels, the snuffers. They took away the fire pans, the bowls. They took away all of these instruments that was made out of gold and silver that was being used to make the daily sacrifice. This is what Daniel was talking about when he said that the daily sacrifice was taken away. Because by taking these instruments, as well as the priests and everybody else, the great men, they took away all into Babylon, the daily sacrifice had ceased. It was no longer able to take place. And so what Daniel is telling us, from the time when the daily sacrifice is taken away and abomination is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, jumping over here to a diagram that I get from the timeline of human history, we see that this actually happened in the year 606 BC. And I have to admit, this part is not genuine information. It's well known or well recognized that the years of captivity for the Israelites lasted from 606 to 536 BC. And what also is understood is that when Daniel was talking about 1,290 days, he was really talking about 1,290 years. There are several prophecies that's given by Daniel in his book, but each time he was actually talking about years. So when we start at the year 606 BC and we add 1,290 years plus 1 year, because there was no year zero, you always have to add 1 year when you're doing these calculations, because there was no such thing as year zero, we end up with 685 AD. And again, remember that we're talking about the temple. It was burned in 606 BC. So then you must ask, what happened to the temple in 685 AD? Well, in 685 AD, they started the construction of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. The same place that Solomon built his temple, the same place that Abraham was about to sacrifice his son Isaac, the same place that Jacob laid his head upon a rock, which is called Mount Moriah. Some would say the holiest place on earth. They built another temple, to some say another god, on that holy site in 685 AD. And so that's what Daniel is talking about when he says the abomination that maketh desolate. You say, well, why does that maketh desolate? What maketh desolate about that place? For that we have to look at the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 24, the Messiah is warning his disciples. In verse 15, he says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So we understand from Daniel that this was to happen in the year 685, and it actually did happen in the year 685. But what the Messiah was telling them is when they actually saw it occur, to flee and to run. And this is what actually happened. The children of Israel that were still in Jerusalem at the time saw this abomination going up, and they actually left Jerusalem. They fled into Eastern Africa and to other parts of the world. They were actually scattered throughout the entire world during that time. And that's what Daniel meant by maketh desolate. But let's go on. Because Daniel says in verse 12, he says, Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 days. Again, we're talking about the temple, but this time we're talking about a blessing. Whereas before we got desolation, this time we're supposed to get a blessing. So when we come into our calculator and we add 1,335 days, we end up with the year 2020. This blessing that Daniel is talking about is the third temple, and he's telling us that it will be constructed in the year 2020. In a previous video, I explained how I wasn't sure if this event was going to happen during the spring feast or the fall feast. But when you jump back over to 2 Kings in chapter 25, you see that the daily sacrifice was taken away in the 5th month. Now, the timing of the Bible is extremely accurate. And so when it tells you that this occurred in the 5th month, you know that they had already had Passover that year, and they had already celebrated the other high holy day of Pentecost that year, or the Feast of Weeks in 606 BC. And so this is why I believe that the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven will be opened during the fall feast of 2020. Now, another way we know that it will occur in the fall feast is by the revelations or the prophecies given by Daniel in chapter 9. The ones talking about the 70 weeks. This is well known to point to the Messiah. Verse 24 says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon the holy city, to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. These are 7 events that were supposed to take place after 70 weeks. Verse 25 says, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandments to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks, and the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. Now, we understand that the decree to rebuild Jerusalem came by Artaxerxes in the year 558 or 557 BC. So when we come over to a spreadsheet that I've created to help me to understand some of these timelines, and start at the year 558, counting the year 557 BC as year 1, and we count 69 weeks, which is 483 days, or 483 years, we end up in 26 AD. And you say, well, what happened in the year 26 AD? This is the year that the Messiah was baptized. We understand that his ministry lasted 3.5 years, and he died in the spring of the year 30 AD. Well, if you go 3 years and 6 months from Passover of 30 AD, you end up with the Feast of Tabernacles of the year 26. And so, like we said, the Bible is extremely accurate in its timing. These days fall to within the month of when it's talking about. And what's talked about over there in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel is how the Messiah's first coming would be during the fall, or during the Feast of Tabernacles of the year 26. Verse 26 tells us how he will be cut off, and by that I mean how he will be killed. It talks about how the temple and the sanctuary will be destroyed, which we know happened in 70 AD. He talks about how the end would come with a flood and a war. So let's look at verse 27. He says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice of the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." So let's break down what he's saying here. This, what he's talking about, confirming the covenant with many for 1 week, is how the Messiah walked with his disciples throughout his ministry. That's what he was doing, was he was teaching his people the covenant and how to live within the Father's laws and rules. They would have recognized the laws from the books read by the Pharisees and the Sadducees at the time, but the Messiah came to make those rules practical. He was the Word made flesh. He was a living example of what they meant, and that's what it means by he was confirming the covenant with many for 1 week. But notice how it says in the midst of the week. This is talking about the crucifying of the Messiah. When you jump back over to our spreadsheet, he started teaching his disciples in the fall of 26. But 3.5 years later, he was crucified on the cross. And that's what it means by in the midst of the week, halfway through the week. This points to a break in the final week. You remember there was supposed to be 70 weeks, but there were 69 weeks before the Messiah showed up. And then there was a break in that last week. Now, during that week, we see all of the things that happened. Talking about the oblation to be ceased. Again, the temple was destroyed. The overspreading of abominations. This is talking about all of the things that happened during the Messiah's time until his second coming, which we understand the second coming to be thousands of years later. And then we see the word desolation again, meaning that people were forced out of the city of Jerusalem, even unto the consummation. That's talking about the time of the Gentiles. He's basically summing up 2,000 years of activities there in that one verse. So you ask, well, how does that play out if he only made the covenant with his disciples for 1 week? Where is the other half of the covenant building period? Well, for that, you have to jump over to Revelation chapter 12. In verse 1, you hear about the great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 7 stars. This event took place in the fall of 2017, when in the sky there was a star constellation involving many of our planets and the moon, the sun, all lined up to make this configuration in the sky, just as it is talked about here in Revelation chapter 12 and 1. You can find out a lot about this if you just put in Revelation 12, sign in the sky. You can see how this was a huge event in 2017, many of which thought it was going to be tied to the rapture, the pre-tribulation rapture. And there were several people disappointed around this. But I believe that they were disappointed because they were looking for the wrong thing. What they should have understood was the spiritual meaning behind what 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 was telling them. Understanding that being caught away was talking about being caught away in the spirit. And this is actually what happened in the year 2017, was you had several of the Messiah's people who were brought out of spiritual Babylon or spiritual Egypt, and they went through an exodus, and they were taken into the wilderness, where they have been learning the law ever since. You jump down there in verse 6 of chapter 12, and it says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." This woman that's being talked about here is the church, the true church, or the bride of Christ, which include those individuals we refer to as the 144,000. There was a lot more than 144,000 individuals that received that call back there in 2014. And they fled into the wilderness, where they have been learning the law, or in other words, confirming the covenant. Some could have came earlier, but many started this covenant building period after the year 2014. And notice right here that they would be in that confirmation period, that covenant confirmation period, for 1,303 days. Now, we do understand that John is talking about days here, because if he had been talking about years, we will be waiting another 1,000 years for the second coming of the Messiah, which wouldn't fit the Father's 7 days for human creation plan. No, what we understand is that the Messiah's first appearance would be on the 5th day, and his second appearance will be on the 7th day. So we're expecting his second appearance to take place sometime around now. So if you jump over here and you look at 1,260 days, you come up with approximately 3.5 years. This is the second part of the covenant building with his disciples. This is the second half. And so when you look at how it started in the fall of 2017, how 3.5 years later will put you in the spring of 2021. This is when I believe that we're going to have the great earthquake. Maybe in the spring of 2021, but most definitely sometime during the year of 2021, we're going to have that global earthquake that we hear about, that's going to shake down every building on the planet. Now, to understand why I say that, you would have to jump over to the Third Testament of the Bible, which you can find a link to in the description of this video. But if you jump down to chapter 55 and verse 7, he says, "When those chosen by me find themselves reunited round my law, the earth and the stars will be shaken, and in the sky there will be signs. Because in that instant the voice of the divine spirit, surrounded by the spirits of the just and of the prophets and the martyrs, will judge the spiritual and material realm." What I understand this to mean is that once this covenant is confirmed by these chosen individuals, then the earth and the stars are going to be shaken. And we will start to see all of those signs that we hear about in Matthew chapter 24, in Revelations, and in several other places. But let me show you one final thing before I close out. I've shown you this table, this Excel spreadsheet that the Father has been revealing to me for about 6 months now. It started when I got the understanding that the days of the 7th month have been planned out in history since about the year 2000 to 2001. Let me show you what I mean. If you go back to the year 2000 and 2001, when we had signs in the sky, and start counting from that year, you'll start to notice a 7th month pattern start to emerge. Notice how over here I have the 7th month, the first day of the month. I have this marked out like this on Enoch's day calendar all the way back to the beginning of human history, back to the date of the birth of Adam. Like we said, the Bible's numbers are extremely accurate, and by just simply entering the data from what we find in the scripture I was able to unlock several of these prophecies, including Daniel's other prophecy, the 2,300 days, points to the year 1884 when we got that third testament of the Bible over there. That was secondary confirmation, because looking at how these months and days line up with years, I was able to backtrack to when the third day of the 6th month fell, and it actually fell in 1884, which was the very year that the Father began inspiring the third testament of the Bible. This was the actual second coming of the Word in 1884. See how you end up right here at 2,300 days? If you go all the way back to the year 417 BC, which according to the book of Ezra, chapter 6 and verse 15, is the year that they finished the second temple. They finished the second temple in the year 417 BC under Darius II. When you use that and calculate 2,300 days, you end up with 1884, again, which is the date we got the third testament of the Bible. But I've covered that in other classes. I guess I just wanted to give some credibility to this spreadsheet here and how these numbers are working out perfectly. But let me show you what happens when you look at the year 2001 being the first day of the 7th month and start counting each day for a year. Now, keep in mind that the Father's years and man's years don't overlap perfectly. The Creator's calendar starts somewhere around the spring equinox there in March. So when you're looking at the Gregorian years, you have to give or take a year. But when you look at the 7th month and the first day of the month being around 2000 and 2001 and start to walk forward, you find that on the 10th day, which should be around 2009 and 2010, and that day of atonement, and you look at what happened in that year, what you find is an earthquake in Haiti that killed 250 million people. That was Atonement Day. And so coming forward, you see how and why all of those individuals went into a covenant building period or a tabernacling period between around 2014. Some could have came earlier, but many started this covenant building period after the year 2014. Now, I have several books here where I've been going in and pulling out dates and references related to this timing. Of course, you have the King James Version of the Bible listed in this column and how it lines up with the days of these years. And there's some additional verses over here from the apocryphal books like Enoch. And there's some other references from Genesis and the book of Revelations. Just to give you an example, if you go over and look in the book of Genesis, chapter 8 and 4, you're going to find that it happened on the 17th day of the 7th month. But you also see that Revelation 12 fell during that same time, talking about the year 2017. But there's another reference that points to it, and that's coming from the book called The Shepherd of Hermas. If you look in Visions 3 of The Shepherd of Hermas, verse 95, it points to the year 2017 as well, which, what do you know, is the year that Hermas Academy was actually created. Of course, I didn't realize this till years later. But right after that Revelations 12 sign in the sky is when Hermas Academy was born. So when you see references in the Bible and it says the so-and-so day of the so-and-so month, those actually go with years. And I'm going to post this table down in the comment section or in the description if it'll fit, so you guys can copy and paste it over in your spreadsheet so you can work with these numbers too. And if you do so, just give me a thank you, if you copy it, and then if you make something out of it, send me a link to it. This is all genuine information, so I can give it to you freely. But if you come up with something good out of it, let me know. But following these verses over here and how they line up with these year dates, as I'll call them, and you start to look at what happens in the year 2021, now that points to the book called The Shepherd of Hermas, Similitude 9, verses 61 and 63, which is the tower being completed. But The Shepherd of Hermas is a very sophisticated book, so I'll save the explanation for that. It may take way too long to explain how the tower is completed. If you do understand how that parable works, look at verses 61 and 63 of Similitude 9, and you'll see how the tower is completed in the year 2021. But what I believe you will understand is if you go over to the book of Haggai and look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. This is the word of the Lord coming to Haggai, talking about Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel. You jump down to verse 6, you can see what he told him. He says, "And thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord." This is why I believe that the earthquake is going to be in the year 2021. The temple will be constructed in 2020. The Father's people will start to hear these voices. Like over there in the book of Daniel chapter 12 and 10, many will be purified and made white. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. This will take place in the year 2020. This is what you'll read about over there in chapter 11 of the book of Revelations, where it's talking about these individuals that have power to shut heaven and to stop rain and such, how they have the ability to control the elements. This is spiritual Israel having gained this power from the Father during the year of 2020, will go out prophesying to the rest of the world. You see verse 7 of chapter 11, it says, "And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them." This is what Daniel is talking about over there in chapter 11 and verse 33. He says, "And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity, and by the spoil many days." This is what's going to take place from the time that the temple is constructed in 2020 until the earthquake. As you see over here in Revelations chapter 11 and verse 13, he says, and the same hour was a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake was slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. Now, I've always said I'd like to see the Aramaic or the Hebrew that this book was originally wrote in, because I think John is missing a few zeros here, considering that the Haitian earthquake killed over 300,000 people. And this one is only going to kill 7,000. I don't know if he meant 700,000 or 7 million, but I believe he's missing some zeros there. If you got something out of the video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button. But to leave a comment either way. And shalom.